In 1923, a small-town school decided to expand its basement. It was supposed to take 2 weeks. By the end of the very first day, the workers refused to go back underground. No accident was reported, no injury was recorded, and yet, every man who had been digging that morning walked away before sunset. What they encountered beneath that school was never written down, but the consequences of that discovery still linger quietly, deliberately over a century later. At the time, the school was considered a model institution, built in the early 1900s. It stood at the center of the town brick walls, tall windows, a bell tower that could be heard from every street. Parents trusted it. Teachers were respected. Children walked its halls without fear. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Morning assemblies were orderly. Attendance records were neat. The principal was known as a man of discipline and morals. The school board proudly called it a foundation for the future. And for years, no one questioned that image until the basement renovation. The building had an old cellar, small, shallow, mostly used for storage. But with growing enrollment, the school board approved an expansion. More space was needed, a deeper foundation, stronger supports. It was routine work. Nothing controversial, nothing secret, at least, not at first. The digging began early on a spring morning. The workers followed the original blueprints, cutting through layers of soil that had not been touched since the building was constructed. Everything was normal for the first few hours. Then one of the shovels struck something solid. At first, they assumed it was stone, possibly an old foundation remnant. That happened sometimes with older buildings. But when they cleared more dirt, the surface didn't behave like rock. It wasn't natural. It was flat, deliberately shaped, too smooth. They dug around it, expecting pipes or structural supports, but there were none. No markings, no explanation in the plans. And then they realized something unsettling. Whatever they had hit wasn't blocking the basement. It was enclosing something. As they dug further, the air changed. Workers later described it as stale and wrong, though none could fully explain what that meant. One man claimed the temperature dropped suddenly. Another said the smell reminded him of old paper mixed with damp stone. No one laughed. No one joked. They uncovered an edge straight, intentional, a wall where no wall was supposed to exist. And behind that wall, something hollow answered back. That was the moment the digging stopped. Word reached the school administration before noon. The principal came down himself, accompanied by 2 board members. They stood at the edge of the excavation, staring at the exposed surface without speaking. The workers expected instructions. Instead, they received silence. After several minutes, the principal gave a simple order: stop digging. No explanation followed. The men were told to pack up their tools and wait for further notice. But there was no further notice. By the end of the day, every worker refused to return. Some quit the project entirely. One left town within the week. No formal complaint was filed. No report was made to the police. No inspector was called. The next morning, the site was sealed. Fresh concrete was poured over the exposed area. New support beams were installed, not according to the original design, but tighter, smaller, more restrictive. The basement expansion continued, just not in that direction. Classes resumed as normal. Children walked above the sealed ground, unaware that the building beneath them was no longer what it had been. No announcement was made to parents. No note appeared in the local paper. In fact, no record of the halted work appeared. Anywhere at all, official documents listed the renovation as completed. Successfully, the blueprints were quietly updated, and whatever had been uncovered that day was a race not destroyed, but hidden. Over time, the story faded. Workers aged. Witnesses moved on. The school continued to operate year after year, untouched by scandal, but some details refused to disappear completely. Maintenance logs showed unusual restrictions around the basement. Certain areas were marked restricted access, though no hazardous materials were listed. Janitors were instructed not to linger. Storage was limited. Doors were reinforced without explanation, and every few years someone would ask a harmless question. Why is that section sealed? Why doesn't the layout match the original design? Why does the principal keep the basement keys himself? Those questions were never answered, because the day the workers struck that wall, the school made a decision not to investigate, not to understand, but to bury. And when institutions choose silence over truth, they don't just hide evidence, they create a space where something unthinkable can remain, untouched. And then, without public discussion or official reason, the school principal ordered the site sealed. No police report, no newspaper article, no explanation, just a wall, and everything it was hiding. These were men who spoke freely their entire lives, men who complained loudly about wages, weather, and work conditions. But after that day beneath the school, they stopped talking about the basement. Altogether, not publicly, not privately, not even years later, no official statements were ever recorded. Everything we know comes from fragments, reconstructed accounts, second-hand remarks, things said once and never repeated. One worker reportedly told his wife that the space under the school didn't feel finished. Another described it as built for something else. Neither explanation satisfied the fear in their voices. What they uncovered beneath the planned excavation did not match any blueprint. The school's original cellar was shallow and rectangular, but the newly exposed area didn't follow that logic. The walls angled inward. Corners were uneven, not like careless construction, but like intentional narrowing, as if the space was designed to limit movement. The smell was the first thing everyone noticed, not decay, not sewage, something older, a dry, stale odor, like paper left too long in a damp place. One worker later compared it to a room that had been closed while something inside was still being used. There were markings on the walls, not graffiti, not symbols anyone could identify. Shallow lines etched into the surface at irregular heights, some low, some just above where a person's head might be. They didn't form words. They didn't form patterns. They formed repetition. One man said it looked like counting marks. Another said it reminded him of someone testing the wall over and over again. There were objects to dot small things, easily overlooked, pieces that didn't belong in a school basement and had no practical use in construction. A fragment of fabric, darkened with age, a bent metal loop fixed into the wall, wooden splinters smoothed down, as if handled repeatedly. None of it was dramatic. None of it was obvious. That's what made it worse, because nothing there suggested an accident. It suggested use. The workers didn't argue about what it was. They argued about what it meant. and every explanation led to the same conclusion. This space had been sealed for a reason. The most unsettling moment came when they realized something else. There were no records of the space ever being closed, no mention of removal, no renovation permits, no documentation of why it existed at all, which meant one of two things was true. Either the space predated, the school end was never disclosed, or it was added later and deliberately erased. That realization changed the mood instantly. The joking stopped. Tools were put down. No one wanted to be the one to go further inside. When the principal arrived, the workers expected questions instead. They were met with instructions, short, controlled, final. No one was asked to explain what they saw. No one was asked to write anything down. The principal did not examine the space closely. He stood at the edge, listened briefly, and made a decision. That was when one worker walked away. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply took off his gloves, set them down, and said he wouldn't be going back underground by the following week. He was gone from town. No forwarding address, no goodbye. People later said he sold his house quickly. Others claimed he left belongings behind. No one knows what became of him. The remaining workers stayed, not because they were convinced, but because walking away had consequences. This was a small town. Jobs were scarce. Authority was respected, and silence was safer than speculation. Fear didn't need to be enforced. It spread on its own. Men stopped discussing the site, even among themselves. Conversations changed when someone entered a room. Eyes lowered when the school was mentioned. Because once silence begins, it becomes a signal, a way of saying, "Don't ask," years later. Some of those workers would still avoid the building entirely. They took longer routes. They crossed the street. They refused maintenance contracts involving the school. And yet, despite all of this, what disturbed them most wasn't what they found, it was what they did. No records of use, no official purpose, no explanation for why the space had been sealed instead of demolished, no evidence of who had been there, no names, no dates, no acknowledgement, just a place that existed, without a past, and that absence, the missing context, the missing history, was more frightening than any object or marking could have been, because spaces don't erase themselves, people do. But the most disturbing part was not what they found beneath the school, it was what was missing. Behind a bricked wall, they found a door. No handle, no lock, no way to open it from the outside. And that was the first sign that whoever built it never intended anyone to leave. The discovery came late in the afternoon. After hours of careful removal, what first appeared to be a solid wall revealed itself to be a seal brick laid over brick, different from the surrounding structure. The masonry wasn't original to the basement. The color didn't match. The mortar was newer, and the work was too deliberate to be structural repair. Someone had closed this off on purpose. When the bricks finally gave way, the workers expected an empty cavity. Instead, they exposed the outline of a doorway set several feet back, a narrow frame, reinforced, heavy. The door itself was made of thick wood reinforced with metal. Strips, age-darkened, scarred, but intact. There was no handle on the outside, no latch, no hinges visible from that side, no mechanism for entry, only a flat surface. And damage, scratches ran vertically down the wood, overlapping each other. Some were shallow, others were deep enough to expose lighter wood beneath at different heights. Low marks, as if made from the floor, mid-level marks, clustered where hands might reach, and higher ones too. High to be accidental. Marks made over time, not one moment, not one event, repetition inside. The space extended into a narrow corridor that opened into a small chamber. The air was stale in a way the rest of the basement wasn't, as if it had been sealed while still in use. The walls inside told a story no document ever recorded, lines etched into the surface. Not symbols, not art, simple vertical marks grouped in uneven clusters, counting marks, some grouped in 4s, some in 5s, some broken, restarted, abandoned near one corner. Numbers had been scratched directly into the wall, inconsistent, misaligned, as if whoever carved them wasn't steady or wasn't educated. There were no furnishings, no beds, no desks, no shelves, only the wall fixtures remained metal rings embedded at irregular intervals, some loose, some worn smooth, one still bent outward, as if force had been applied repeatedly. This wasn't storage, and it wasn't accidental. Everything about the space suggested duration, long-term, use, repeated occupancy, and eventual erasure. The workers didn't speculate out loud. They didn't need to. Everyone understood the same thing at the same time. This room had been used and then hidden. The builders assumed protocol would follow, that authorities would be contacted, that the site would be documented. Instead, school officials arrived, not police, not inspectors, administrators. The decision did not come from the construction team. It came from the school board, from men whose names appeared on plaques and donor lists. The order was simple: stop work immediately, seal the space, no further access permitted, no measurements, no photographs, no written reports. The workers were dismissed early. That day they were told the space was not part of the project, that it was irrelevant to expansion, that continuing would create unnecessary complications. When one man asked whether authorities would be notified, the response was immediate. That wouldn't be necessary. The door was re-bricked by nightfall this time. With fresh mortar, no one was allowed to return underground, not even to retrieve tools. The following morning, the school opened as usual. Children filled the classrooms above a space that no longer officially existed, and something else began to happen. Old ledgers vanished from the school office. Attendance, books from the early years were removed. Maintenance logs went missing, not destroyed publicly, just gone. Staff who asked about the missing records were told they had been relocated, or archived, or misplaced during renovations. Different answers, same outcome. The paper trail thinned rapidly. It was as if someone had gone through the school's history with intention not to revise it, but to shorten it, to make certain years disappear. No formal explanation was ever given. No inquiry followed. The workers were paid and dismissed, and the door beneath the school was sealed again, this time with the approval of authority. By the end of that week, the room beneath the school no longer existed on paper, and by the end of that month, neither did the records that might have explained why it ever did. Every school keeps attendance records. This one didn't, at least. Not consistently, and once someone noticed, they realized the missing numbers weren't mistakes. They were patterns. In most schools, attendance books are boring. Names, dates, absences, explained by illness or weather. Paperwork meant to prove that children existed, showed up, and went home. At this school, those records were strangely thin. Some years were detailed. Others barely existed. Entire terms reduced to summary numbers instead of names. And when investigators later tried to reconstruct enrollment, something unsettling emerged. The number of children entering the school did not match the number leaving it on paper. Students transferred out, but there were no receiving schools listed. No districts named dot. No destinations recorded. Just a quiet phrase repeated again and again. Withdrawn. Teachers noticed it first. Long before anyone outside did, children would stop coming to class, not one or two, sometimes several within the same year. Occasionally from the same classroom. There were no announcements, no goodbyes, no explanations offered to students or staff. Desks were reassigned, names were erased from chalkboards. Lessons continued. Teachers who asked questions were told the same thing every time. The families had moved. The children had been transferred. It was none of their concern. And then something else began to happen. Teachers resigned, not retired, not reassigned, resigned. Suddenly, some left mid-year. Some didn't finish the week. A few didn't even collect their final paychecks in letters preserved decades later. The language is cautious but consistent. I no longer feel comfortable in this environment. Certain matters have come to my attention. I believe it is best for me to leave immediately. Number. Accusations, no specifics, just urgency. Replacement teachers arrived quickly, too quickly for a small town, and they were instructed not to review old class records, only current ones. The pattern only becomes clear after the basement discovery. Before that moment, the missing children looked like normal attrition. Families moved. Records were sloppy. It was a different time after that moment. The numbers stop being random. They cluster. Specific age ranges appear more frequently in the withdrawn category. Younger children vanish from records more often than older ones, and certain years show unusually high turnover, followed by gaps in documentation. Absence, it turns out, can be evidence, especially when it repeats with discipline. Silence wasn't accidental in this school. It was policy. Parents were discouraged from lingering. School meetings were brief. Questions about past students were deflected or ignored. No reunions were held. No alumni lists maintained. No historical displays created. The school presented itself as forward-looking, uninterested in its own past. Then, years later, someone tried to speak, a former student, by then an adult. They contacted a local official with concerns about their time at the school. Not accusations, concerns, memories that didn't fit, rooms that shouldn't have existed, children they remembered, who no one else did. Within months, that former student was committed to an institution, not convicted, not tried, declared unstable. Their claims were cited as evidence of delusion. Their testimony was never recorded publicly. Medical records from that commitment remain sealed, but the timing is not, and neither is the outcome. Once again, Someone who questioned the school's history was removed from the conversation entirely. No investigation followed, no inquiry reopened, no files re-examined. The past stayed buried, not because it was forgotten, but because it was inconvenient. By the time anyone realized, children were missing from the records themselves had already been rewritten, and the next question was no longer what happened. It was who decided it should never be asked again. No bodies were ever reported. That's why the story survived. Because in the absence of bodies, there was no crime, and without a crime, there was nothing to investigate. When rumors began to circulate quietly, privately, authorities responded the way institutions always do. They didn't deny anything outright. They simply pointed to the paperwork. No missing persons. Reports had been filed. No death certificates existed. No crime scene had been identified. And so, officially, nothing had happened. In the early 1900s, investigations didn't begin with suspicion. They began with documentation. If records didn't show a problem, the problem didn't exist. This school had records. Clean ones. Attendance books showed withdrawals, not disappearances. Renovation permits were approved. Inspections were signed off. The absence of evidence wasn't a failure, it was the strategy. Local authorities relied heavily on institutional statements. If the school administration said there was no issue, that statement became the final word. No interviews were conducted with workers, no follow-up with former teachers, no questions asked of families who had moved away. Media outlets followed the same path. Small-town newspapers depended on official access. Printing a story without confirmation meant risking exclusion, or worse, so they printed nothing. No articles, no editorials, no investigations. Silence is easier to maintain when everyone benefits from it. The renovation resumed within weeks, not as planned, but as revised, original. Expansion plans called for a deeper, wider basement, more storage, additional utility space. Those plans were quietly altered. The new basement would be smaller, shallower. Certain sections would remain untouched. No explanation was provided for the change. Inspectors approved it without comment. Blueprints were updated, and the earth that had been disturbed was sealed again. Walls were reinforced. Concrete was poured thicker than necessary. Access points were eliminated. What had been uncovered was not removed. It was reburied. This is the part that unsettles historians the most. There was no violence required to make this story disappear. No threats documented. No arrests made. No force used in public view. The system worked because it didn't need to crush anyone openly. It just needed to file the right forms. Paperwork is quieter than coercion. When records say something never existed, memory alone isn't enough to prove otherwise, especially when memory belongs to workers, teachers, or children, people without authority. Over the years, questions faded. Workers aged or died. Teachers relocated. Students grew up unsure of what they remembered, and the school continued to operate. New generations passed through its halls, unaware of what lay beneath their feet. The building became ordinary again. That's how crops last decades, not by constant effort, but by momentum. Once a narrative is established, most people accept it. Challenging, it requires time, access, and credibility, and those are exactly the things institutions control. Then, by accident, something changed. Not through investigation, not through courage, through routine, bureaucracy. During a records audit decades later, an archivist was tasked with organizing old municipal storage, forgotten files, rolled documents, dust-covered cabinets no one had opened in years. Among them were blueprints, original blueprints, not the revised ones. The plans dated back to before the renovation, before the basement was sealed, before the story vanished. They showed dimensions that no longer matched the building, rooms that no longer existed, corridors that ended were solid. Walls now stood, and beneath the school, a space that had never been acknowledged. In any official version of the building, the archivist flagged the discrepancy as a clerical error, but it wasn't an error. It was the first surviving proof that something had been deliberately removed from the record, because if the blueprints were wrong, then the walls were lying, and the next question wasn't what was hidden, it was why someone went to so much trouble to make sure. No one ever looked again. A janitor's storage box revealed more than police files ever did, because police files only exist when someone decides a crime has occurred. These files existed because someone forgot to destroy them. The discovery didn't happen in an archive or a courthouse or a police basement. It happened in a maintenance room decades after the renovation. During another routine inspection, a janitor was instructed to clear out old storage, broken desks, rusted tools, unlabeled boxes no one had opened in years. One box stood out, not because it was locked, not because it was hidden, because it was labeled basement, pre-revision. Inside were documents that were never supposed to survive long enough to be read again. Maintenance logs, expense sheets, internal memos written in language meant for officials, not the public. They didn't describe construction, they described control. Entries referenced restricted access points, monitoring, periods, containment, reinforcement, words that do not belong in a school. 1. Log noted increased maintenance costs for an area that officially did not exist. Another referenced noise mitigation beneath the structure years after the basement was supposedly sealed. This wasn't a one-time incident. The documents showed repeated attention, repeated oversight, repeated investment. Whatever lay beneath the school wasn't abandoned. It was managed. The most disturbing part wasn't what the files described directly, it was how casually they described it. No alarm, no urgency, no moral language, just routine, like replacing pipes, like repainting classrooms, like repairing a roof. One memo mentioned that access would be limited to authorized personnel only, and that schedules must not interfere with instructional hours, which means something required supervision. While children were being taught upstairs, that realization changes everything. For years, possibly decades, students sat in classrooms above a space their parents were never told existed. Lessons were taught, tests were taken, school bells rang, and below them, something required containment. The files never explicitly described what the space was used for. They didn't have to. What matters is that it had a purpose, and that Purpose extended far beyond construction. Expense. Logs showed ongoing funding. Allocations labeled under vague categories. Structural integrity. Special storage. Security enhancement. Not emergency spending. Planned. Spending. There were no dates marking an end. Only continuations. Psychological. Horror doesn't come from imagining monsters. It comes from understanding systems, from realizing that whatever happened beneath that school was normalized enough to be budgeted, approved, signed, and forgotten. One document referenced a directive to ensure no unscheduled access during school hours, not to protect children, but to protect operations. Another mentioned that exterior entrances had been permanently removed to reduce risk of exposure. Exposure to what? The janitor didn't understand what he was reading, but he understood enough to know these papers didn't belong in a broom closet. When he asked a supervisor about them, he was told they were outdated, misfiled, not relevant. He was instructed to return them to storage, not to report them, not to copy them, just to put them back. That instruction alone confirmed their importance, because irrelevant documents don't scare institutions. Relevant ones do. What followed was quiet. No investigation was opened. No authorities notified, no public disclosure made. The files were relocated, not destroyed, moved somewhere safer, somewhere controlled, and the janitor was reassigned, not fired, not punished, just relocated. The system didn't need to silence him, it just needed to move him out of the way. Here's the part that lingers. The school never closed, not after the renovation, not after the sealed basement, not after the files surfaced. It still operates. Children still attend classes there today. Parents still drop them off. Teachers still lock the doors at the end of the day. Above a structure whose full purpose has never been acknowledged, above a space that required monitoring long after it was supposed to be gone, above a history that was buried not because it was ancient, but because it was inconvenient. The documents proved that basement wasn't a mistake, it was a function. And the most unsettling truth is this: the building was never abandoned. The records were, and the school is still standing. Some stories don't disappear. They're buried carefully, deliberately, until silence becomes their proof. By the time the document surfaced, it was already too late for outrage. No witnesses were alive who could testify with certainty. No physical evidence remained that could force an investigation. And most importantly, no one in authority had any incentive to reopen the past, because acknowledging this story would not expose one crime, it would expose a method. The reason you've never heard this story before isn't because it lacked evidence. It's because the evidence was never meant to be interpreted outside the system that created it. Every decision surrounding the school followed a familiar pattern. No bodies meant no crime. No crime meant no investigation. No investigation meant no record. And without records, history quietly moves on. Local newspapers relied on official statements. Officials relied on incomplete documentation. And incomplete documentation relied on time to do what force could not: erase memory when rumors surfaced decades later. They were easy to dismiss. Too old, too vague, too disturbing to be useful. People don't fight ghosts when institutions insist there were never any bodies. But this school was not an isolated case. Across different countries, in different decades, similar patterns appear again and again. Schools, hospitals, orphanages, religious institutions, places built on trust. In many of these cases, records show the same language you saw in the basement files. Restricted access, internal use, containment, monitoring, always administrative, never emotional, never human, and always buried beneath paperwork. The truth is, systems don't need secrecy to survive. They need obedience. They rely on the assumption that people won't ask questions that make their own world feel unsafe, because asking those questions carries a cost. Teachers who noticed irregularities left quietly. Students who spoke out were labeled unstable. Workers who asked too much found themselves transferred, reassigned, or erased from the narrative, not punished, removed. Silence wasn't enforced with violence. It was enforced with procedure. That's why the story didn't break. There was never a single moment where truth could explode into the open. Instead, it leaked slowly and was absorbed by time and time favors. Institutions, the most disturbing part isn't that something happened beneath that school. It's that everyone involved behaved rationally, according to the rules they were given. No one saw themselves as a villain. They saw themselves as employees, administrators, caretakers of stability, and stability in systems like this is more valuable than truth. Which brings us to now. The school still operates. Children still walk its halls. Parents still trust its walls. Nothing outwardly marks it as different from any other building, designed to educate and protect. And that's the point. Because if a place like this can hide something unthinkable for decades, then the lesson wasn't lost on other institutions. They learned what worked. They learned how silence spreads faster than truth, how paperwork outlives memory, how absence is harder to prosecute than violence, and how history, when instructed properly, looks the other way. This story doesn't end with closure. There were no arrests, no public apologies, no reckoning, only a pattern repeated quietly. Globally, wherever authority operates without accountability, if a respected school could hide something like this beneath its foundation, what do you think hospitals learned? What do you think orphanages learned? What do you think other institutions learned and never wrote down? If stories like this make you uneasy, that's not an accident. They aren't meant to comfort you. They're meant to remind you that silence has a structure. And if you want to keep uncovering histories that were buried on purpose, not for shock, but for understanding, stay with this channel, because some truths don't disappear. They wait for someone willing to listen.